Cohen grew up in Crofton, Maryland, and is now working on her PhD in literature at the University of Maryland. She received her MFA in poetry from Maryland in 2001. Poems that appear in issue 14, which she had, Smartish Pace, are her first publication, and we're very happy. She won in second place in the 6th annual Erskine Poetry Prize for her poem Hysterectomy. And her poem Hard Scrabble was also a finalist for that prize, which is pretty cool. She got 2. What I admire most about English poetry is her playfulness and her amazing vocabulary, both of which belie her great intelligence. And I'm not exaggerating, she really is. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce April.
I want to say intelligent things to you, I really do. I had prepared intelligent things to say, but somehow in this bohemian of a setting, and since Duncan Primo is here, I feel like we're back in town hall. But I'll try to keep track of the time. If undergraduate poetry students are correct and the point of what we do is to express ourselves, then I have to be honest, which is when I first read Stefan's email describing the event tonight as a blowout release party for your favorite local, non-profit, privately funded, independently published Natty Vogue poetry magazine, an event with live music and an open bar, I became nervous. Not because I'm trying to cultivate an Emily Dickinson-esque lack of social skills, but because the poems that have come out of my recent experience could be called, in non-academic terms, bummers. Poems that describe my experience over the past few years with multiple sclerosis, a progressively debilitating neurological disorder, as well as about my mother's recent recurrence of metastatic gynecological cancer, are not the sort of thing that one whips out to entertain one's drunken friends at a party. And yet, they sure do take on that useless old romantic myth about poets having to suffer in order to write good poetry. My own poetry is in part a product of the University of Maryland's MFA program, the star of which is our own Stanley Plumlee, who writes beautiful, understated poems rife with rural imagery. And while I was in that program, I worried that my poetry would be doomed to obscurity because I had led a relatively happy childhood. In the suburbs, middle class, loved and supported by my non-alcoholic, non-fundamentalist parents. and my ornithological and horticultural knowledge were both limited. But then, shit, as it does happen, and I came down with an incurable and poorly understood illness, and presto, I was granted what my dissertation advisor once called, in a horrible, unintentional pun, a critical spine for my work. Here's a poem about the irony of that. This is called Hard Scrabble, and you'll find it in your brand spanking new copy of Smartish Pace issue 4. Hard Scrabble. My first poetry teacher grew up in a small town in Ohio, and the first thing I learned about poetry was that you had to have a hard life to do it. A life of rock quarries or steel, a stoic father with calloused palms. One summer, I took a trip from my East Coast suburban duplex townhome into the rolling heartland. The road I took cut straight through a mountain. I hurtled, shot through the sheer avalanche force threatening from both sides. The smell of fresh skunk followed me. At night, resting semis lined up on the shoulder, segmented like pupa. Later, they emerge, new creatures. The early morning steams with their breath. Stopping at the roadside folk museum, I heard a story telling how once a coal vein was ignited and the very earth itself steamed. I looked at corn husk dogs. I sat in the diner, where at the end of the third shift, they throw a pitcher of water over the grill and a wall of steam rises, a great rolling billow. Is this what poetry is made of? These rocky elements, growing things, these misty ones dissolving, the domestic or the strange. On the road again, the burned-out barns became endless. I learned, a few years later, staring into the cold white constellations dotting the dark, inscrutable landscape of my MRI, about hardship, about hardening. So now I'm going to go back and tell you just how the aforementioned shit happened. I woke up one morning in the fall of 2003, just as I was beginning my doctoral work, with dim, blurred vision in my right eye, and I was subjected to a series of tests, including a CAT scan, which revealed nothing, and an MRI, which revealed brain lesions, and a spinal tap, which revealed that there are certain feelings that no poetry can adequately describe. And then a 3-day hospital stay with a course of high-dose IV steroids to reduce the inflammation in my brain, and I emerged with my diagnosis of MS. And this second poem that I'm going to read for you tonight, entitled First Flare, is about all of that. It's not a very good poem, as you'll see, because how can you write with clarity about something that is so sudden and so foreign? And it grasps, I think, at metaphor, trying to find the familiar in the strange. So if anybody has any suggestions for revision, I'm happy to hear them. First Flare. The CAT scan was like an inconstant lover. Hot with contrast, you held your breath and slid in and out of its whirling body, gripping the table white-knuckled like a headboard. But MRI is binding. When loss of vision swept your right eye like a veil, they sent you there at last to shed your rings and baubles. Whatever pierces is verboten. They swathed you in wash-worn cloth. The IV circling your arm is a phylactery. They stuff your ears with soft plugs, and then over your head descends the plastic cage, the skull's rider. Your chin can't tremble. From here on in, to move a muscle is to ruin everything. A button's pressed, and it sucks you in. Your ceiling's now 2 inches from your face. You close your eyes. Psyche lay blinded on the bed, and Cupid winged down all around her. The flapping starts, the worry, machinery sizing up, taking in, measuring your every fold and bone, your inner pose, jackhammers, a skipping disc. In between, the quiet's deadly. You're abandoned, a lonely gurney in an endless corridor. They slide you out and shoot you up and push you back, tasting on the back of your throat the writhing sting of gadolinium. Now the ratcheting is comforting. It lulls you, rocks and cradles, holds your poor racked skull in a call of muffled noise. You're a child sleeping while mother rattles dishes in the kitchen, all fight gone. A gleaming needle's already drawn the thick, clear liquid from your spine. The nurse braced you as you shuddered air and, sickened, knew your center. She gently let you down as your puppet strings went slack. You can't unknow it now. You feel it always down the back of you as a wire feels a current. It plucks you like a fiddle string. You're all acoustics, vibrating. You'll marvel later at yourself in celluloid, each whorl of you a constellation, you're star-studded. The doctor speaks in a medieval language, enhanced signal. White matter adjacent to left occipital horn. High right parietal cortex. It sounds heraldic, all the axons in your brain and spinal cord and optic nerve rampant like some charging noble beast, slipping their tethers, banners flying red like the thin thread of blood that keeps backing into the line. They've laid you out and wheeled you down the hall, inert as Melusine above the water, while underneath the surface, you're all monsters. A constant drip goes in. The fusty breathing of the patient in the next room is all night for 3 nights, like a great galleon, timbers creaking from port to starboard. So as you can see, my first instinct in the beginning was to try to make the whole thing a little bit sexy. And my second instinct was, in the end of the poem, was to try and make it a little bit noble. But I do have a little crush on my very good-looking and very brilliant neurologist, so I think that the first instinct was more authentic. And I would venture to say that the sicker I became, the more I realized this is being recorded, but I'm going to say it, needed to get laid. And I was single at the time, and so in order to write about certain aspects of the illness, such as learning how to give myself injections, I had to invent an imaginary lover. The you in this third poem I'm going to read for you, entitled Injection Obad, does not exist, which I suppose is the sort of thing I'm not supposed to reveal. But my illness has also made it impossible for me to shut up. Injection Obad. Now that I needs must pierce myself nightly, let me tell you what it's like without you. Ritual of sterile white, exposed expanse of arm, thigh, hip, or belly. I rotate around my body as though it were a clock or cartwheel. Week to week, refill my little box of syringes monthly, like phases of the moon. I swab and then count down to let the alcohol evaporate completely, then shoot the needle home, depress the plunger fully. By now, I know without looking when it's finished. I listen for the wheeze of something emptying, like a child slurping dregs of milkshake through a straw. I slip the silvery dart out like a lover slips from cooling morning sheets. The thin medicine spreads under the skin and swells, a beeless sting, a pale welt rising in a corona of red, small bloody stick at the center. I press cotton there, then an ice pack to dull the itch and ache and burn. Drop the drugless needle in the red bucket, significant as William's wheelbarrow, its cheery yellow biohazard sticker on its side. Where it dings, glass on glass, then settles indistinguishable among the pile of its spent brothers. If you were here, I'd make a joke with you about how I should hold a contest. Guess the number of sharps in the bucket, like jelly beans in a jar. Every morning, waking, there's a moment when I'm bodiless, when you are with me. Then I remember. Funny how even as my neural pathways scar and stiffen, still my heart cries, yield, yield. Before I read my two concluding poems, I'd like to take a moment to make a more formal observation on what I see as a dilemma in writing about your own illness. A dilemma, perhaps not as great as putting people down and partying, but a dilemma nonetheless. We're writing and reading during a time of great medical advancement, which enables us to see inside our very bodies, and as such, our store of imagery is vaster than ever before. But when the poet is also a patient, a problem arises. The experience of illness or injury may lend poet-patient a certain ethos of authenticity, right? A gravitas. But at the same time, it places him or her in the path of a dangerous pathos. And he or she must attempt to write with honesty and imaginative rigor, particularly vigilant against the traps of self-pity and mere confessionalism. So I ask, is there a contradiction between the task of the poet, for whom minute realistic detail is often key, and the task of the patient, who in an effort to heal must somehow cope with or even attempt to change reality? In Illness as Metaphor, critic Susan Sontag writes that the most truthful way of regarding illness and healthiest way of being ill is one most purified of, most resistant to, metaphoric thinking. So, does health imply the simplistic resolution of paradoxes that poetry encapsulates and preserves? Consider this. Poetry about the diseased body inverts the tradition of representing emotional suffering as physical through figurative language. What did she just say? Listen to this. If the depiction of emotional pain requires a natural object, right, or an objective correlative, to what image or metaphor can the poet turn when the pain is literally embodied? I'll give you an example. The problem begins with reading. The poet, such as myself, with a disorder of the central nervous system, will surely face a crisis of interpretation rereading Emily Dickinson's "I felt a cleaving in my mind as though my brain had split." You know when you're 15 and you think all love songs on the radio are not you? Imagine the absurd situation of the poet who is also a bypass surgery patient, facing an entire cannon full of figuratively broken hearts. Then to the writing. Does the image of a mermaid, for instance, fail to accurately represent the experience of a paraplegic? Is it too saccharine? The poet-patient must have a sense of humor, albeit a dark one, and ironically juxtaposing a beautiful image against a less than ideal reality can at least create a powerful ambiguity. It would be naive, I think, to invest poetry with the powers of healing. But we've learned from Dr. William Carlos Williams, who would know, that men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. So, poetry is not penicillin, nor should it be. But metaphor must be employed. If you've ever been to the emergency room, metaphor must be employed as part of the triage process. As this next poem, this fourth poem, entitled Pain Scale, observes. Pain scale. What you want to know is why, and more importantly, how to make it stop. But they want to know what kind. Stabbing, burning, a dull ache, and how much. Quantify from 1 to 5, mild to excruciating. Choose from these 5 cartoon faces. The first, with its slanty cartoon brows furrowed in illustrative discomfort. The fifth, with its rainbow-shaped mouth downturned and tears depending from its anguished cartoon eyes. You feel just that absurd. You wonder, where is the screening smiley face? At what number, or fraction of a number, do you draw the line between unbearable and whatever came before it? Imagine a fate worse than death, that the remedy depends on the specificity and precision of your language, just when pain renders you inarticulate. What if it's too familiar to describe, too normal now to measure, the old ache tightening at the base of the skull and radiating around to the temples, or the reluctant muscles of the calves seizing up like rubber bands, gut wrench, menstrual pang, nature's rich variety. Since my entry into the kingdom of the sick, as Susan Sontag would call it, I've been inundated with pamphlets and platitudes, albeit well-meaning, crammed with quasi-medical doctrine about the powers of positive thinking. My own thinking, as it comes from my training in poetry, may be called negative, but only in the Keatsian sense. Negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Disease demands a cure, and often lacks one. Poetry refuses easy resolution, and the poet-patient who deals both literally and figuratively in transformation. Attempts to produce a poetics that enacts a paradox, the meaningless injustice of physical suffering depicted in meaningfully wrought language. This last poem, which you'll find in your copy of Smartish Pace, is about that paradox. It's also about my mother. Hysterectomy. I hope it was a relief for you to be rid of it. Empty now after the passage of my brother and myself through it tens of years ago. Or not quite empty because of the cluster of cysts that bloomed there. I say bloomed, and think of how I teach metaphor to my beginning poetry students. What blooms? I'd ask animatedly. Flowers, they'd respond dully. And I've already got some in mind, your favorites. Marigolds, bursts of orange and red like little suns. Why like little suns? See how metaphors proliferate? A riot, a welter, out of control. One could say they metastasize, like cells. Anyway, empty, as language is. Almost empty, but for how we figure it. The surgeon's silvery scalpel incised first through soft skin and the flesh that gives, then further to the indurate, a ropey tangle of adhesion and keloid. A uterine garden, to extend the conceit, from a grotesque briar rose, fallopians branching. See now how the allusion functions, how the speaker draws from outside the poem to bring in another layer of meaning. Meaning, such as it is. Was the surgeon that romantic? Did he grow up reading fairy tales? How would he describe the absurdly red, wet object sitting in the stainless steel tray afterward for biopsy? I'd liken it to something more specific, maybe, more personal. An empty pocket after Tashlich? A collapsed balloon? When one popped at my 3rd birthday party, you tell me, I ran to you and Dad demanding, "Fix it!" And that was the first hard lesson, that some things are irreparable. Or is it incurable? 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The night after your surgery, I do my daily injection and then sleep. I dream we hand each other thorny roses, they prick us and we bleed. I wake and laugh at the cliche, at the failure of the poetic imagination. Pretty funny. Hysterical, you might say. Not irrational from fear or emotional shock, but in the other sense of the word, causing unrestrained laughter. No, I exaggerate. Not unrestrained. More funny peculiar than funny ha-ha. Good material for a poem, you tell me on the phone. Fertile soil, if you will. Fertile as that organ once was, so pluck it out, pluck it forth, this source. My own illness is multiple sclerosis, a name unwieldy on the tongue. And I wonder, what if it were called simply many scars? Our words are acquired like wounds. What a relief it would be, I think these days, if I could excise that part of my mind, or is it my brain, that plays these maddening tricks? Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Anybody needs to refill a drink, they can do it real quick. Maybe like a couple while I'm introducing the next poet. Thank you.